Greetings and welcome to the Miami Cybersecurity Summit session on securing the cloud. I'm Kathleen Moriarty, CTO for Center for Internet Security, and I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists in alphabetical order. And I'll have them each provide a little bit of background on themselves. So Joseph Carlson, could you please?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Joseph Carson. I'm Chief Security Scientist and Advisory CISO at Thycotic, or actually Delinea, which is the new name of Thycotic and Centrify. So we've actually recently rebranded under a new name, Delinea. It's a pleasure to be here, joining in from Tallinn, Estonia, and really looking forward for an exciting conversation today.
Excellent, thank you. Kenneth Kay?
Kenneth Kay, I work with JupiterOne. I have 15 some years of security experience doing all sides of operations stuff, and now I do compliance work.
Great, thank you. Alexander Lawrence.
Yeah, I'm Alexander Lawrence. I'm a principal security architect here at Sysdig, and I have been working in the overall kind of DevOps space for quite some time and have a fairly extensive background in open source and security.
Great. Prakash Nagpal.
Hey, good to be here with everybody. Prakash Nagpal, been in tech about 25 years, the past 15 years in security. My job at Apaegis is to align product direction and messaging with our customer needs. Apaegis provides secure access to the cloud by bridging identity, permissions, policy, and devices with a focus on a distributed workforce that includes third parties and contractors.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, Matt Taylor.
Yes, hello, I'm Matt Taylor. I'm a solutions engineer with Wiz. I've been working with cloud security for about 8 or 9 years now with a handful of cybersecurity vendors. I've been fortunate to work with hundreds of customers over the years, helping everything from securing the initial phases of movement to the cloud, as well as increasing security posture for existing cloud deployments. Prior to that, I spent about 10 years in the financial sector, working in various IT roles covering infrastructure, disaster recovery, compliance, and security. So pleasure to be here today.
Great, thank you all for the wonderful introductions. This is going to be a really interesting panel, and I look forward to the discussion. So with that, I'm going to kick it off with our first question. Should a company that has already made significant investments into an on-prem security still migrate to the cloud? And what benefits does cloud adoption offer? Does doing so mean giving up on all on-prem security? And so with this, Kenneth, could you please kick this off?
Sure. The way I see this is the sunk cost fallacy is busy at work here. The idea that just because you've invested significantly in something that you refuse to abandon it when something better is available, I think it haunts many well-established organizations. Cloud adoption offers huge improvements in terms of cost savings, the shared security model, and the increased security and the cost savings due to the shared security model. But there may be, depending upon your company, certain data or workloads for which cloud computing isn't optimal, legal, or cost-effective, in which case a hybrid solution is the best. So you don't have to move everything to the cloud, but there are a lot of things that you could and that you would save a lot on and get better security out of.
Okay, great. Thank you. Joseph.
Absolutely. I think we have to get the reality is that most organizations have already moved some of their business to the cloud. That's the kind of the fact. And the question is really here is about, what remaining things do you have that you're kind of holding on to, that you've invested heavily on premise? And I really think, in today's world, we have to consider that almost everyone's homes, where most people are still in a hybrid or remote working, those are almost like tiny little, kind of miniature clouds of their own. That basically means that many employees are accessing remotely into the organization. And by adopting cloud and moving more to the cloud, it means that you don't have to be experts in everything. It almost becomes where you can actually just use the services which you need in order to do your business. And this is where organizations really need to focus on, is that how can I not have this massive overhead? When you think about traditional on-premise, if you want to have high availability, it means you have to have multiple systems. You have to have the expertise in the underlying technology, whether it being the operating system, the hardware, the heating, the electricity costs, all of those accumulate. And it also, from a cost perspective, It's also into the actual, the ownership of that, depreciation costs. You have to think about the long term and really think about what is the benefits. And you also think about get automatic updates. Organizations need to become more agile, more dynamic in the ability to adopt, and change the business as needed, such as we've seen recently, in the pandemic itself, that organizations really need to be flexible. And cloud adoption allows that. Cloud adoption allows you to be flexible. It allows you to get the services that you need just to focus on your business and remove a lot of those underlying costs that can be significant. So absolutely, even if you've invested heavily on premise, at some point you're going to need to diversify, and you're going to need to change that in order to adopt. And you also get into where it's not just about you're building on and adding security on top of things. You're actually getting it by design natively, from the solutions themselves. So I think organizations are going to find it hard to not take advantage of that.
Okay, great. Excellent points from both of you. Just the agility added, and then the ability to move away from certain types of experts being on staff are really great and interesting points. So now I'll dive into the next question. Hybrid cloud or multi-cloud are common as they can be tailored to fit an organization's particular needs. What are the benefits and challenges of each? How do companies decide which is right for them? And for this one, I'd like to turn to Alexander.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of comes down to what is the use case, how are they trying to accomplish their goals, right? Like it's a difficult question to answer because the answer is typically, any of them, both of them, all of them, none of them. It really comes down to what is the overall workflow necessary for what's trying to happen. And often the answer is, well, it's probably some sort of hybrid because there might be a reason to do dev or prod in one place or the other, or vice versa, right? Like it can go either direction. And so it ends up having a very interesting security model around that, right? Like it ends up letting you having to live in multiple worlds at once, trying to figure out what is the best way to go forward with whatever the particular need is. And in our personal case, I think we see a lot of development happening in a more on-prem style world because they're developing on their laptops these days, right? They're trying to do what they need to do locally, and then they're pushing that to a cloud source of someplace to run the actual production workload. And they're trying to find ways to do those things so they don't have to re-architect every step along the way. And so we're seeing interesting adoption of more cloud native oriented technologies to help enable those things and live in that multi-cloud world, be that containers, Kubernetes, whatever the enablement is for the particular resource they're trying to push. So.
Okay, great. And this next question really gets at the heart of some of the drive for the work we do at CIS around configuration. And we know that having essential cyber hygiene in place and your posture assessment being in place has a significant impact. And so with that, misconfiguration still continues to be the greatest threat to cloud security and is the leading cause of cloud data breaches. What steps should be taken before moving to the cloud? How do you identify misconfigurations after cloud migration, especially when adding new cloud services? So with this, could we begin with Prakash?
Yeah, thank you, Kathleen. So I'm going to cheat a little bit, right? You said, what steps should companies take before moving to the cloud? I think companies have kind of moved to the cloud already in some sense and have not addressed some of these issues, right? So there's misconfigurations, like you said, account for between 3/4 to all data breaches, right? They're usually the root cause. So I think there's 3 elements that I think need to be addressed. Is one, and I'm going to speak about the context that I'm most aware of, right? I'm not going to talk about, was a container alive and should you have shut it down? I'm talking more about misconfigurations associated with permissions and who has access to what platforms and infrastructure. So first, establish a baseline. The baseline should cover identity and permission, consolidate the notion of identity across platforms. So Jack's identity on AWS is the same identity for an in-house application. It is the same Jack that is using a shared account on a development system, right? Make sure you have this notion of identity consolidated. The second part is understanding who has access to do what permissions do they actually have, what have they actually used, and what has been over provisioned for them. Right? It's good to develop first a baseline, Have you granted, granted Kathleen root access to AWS and Salesforce and cloud applications? Because we don't nobody trusts Kathleen. I'm kidding, Kathleen. So make sure she only has access to what she does. And everybody's talked so far about the agility of the cloud and things changing so fast. So the second part is continuously monitor and tune. If Kathleen or Jack's role changes, their permissions should change accordingly. It's not a static thing, right? You've got to continuously know, because the baseline is a starting point, it is not the end point. And the third thing, not really associated with misconfiguration, but often leads to exploitation of misconfiguration is abstract device risk, right? So that unmanaged versus managed devices do not pose different risks. Try to find technology that can abstract a device from being able to send malware into the cloud that can take advantage of the misconfigurations. So I would say those three, right? Establish a baseline, continuously monitor and tune, and make sure you abstract this device risk are the core things that organizations can do.
Great, thank you. And Matt?
Yeah, no, I think Prakash made some very good points there. And just to kind of follow up on there, I think, addressing the security persona when moving to the cloud, what can you do ahead of time? And I think the first step is very obvious, but often missed. It's to have a plan. So a lot of times I'll walk into an organization and I'll meet with the security team who was unaware of cloud movement and all of a sudden found themselves having a large or complex cloud estate to secure. And that's because typically you've got an application team or you've got a development team or some type of product team that's already consuming cloud services, whether or not you have an official program to move to the cloud. So having conversations early is key. Reach out to other stakeholders within the organization and find out what they're doing and how you can support that. Some of the things that you want to know are which cloud service providers are they consuming or planning to consume? What services do they plan on consuming? It's not just a world where we're going to take an on-premises VM and move to, say, an AWS EC2 instance. They might want to refactor their application, so understand their desires and their needs. Another key component is what's the benchmark we're going to use? Like, what are the frameworks and the compliance structures that we're going to use to measure success, and how are we going to implement those? And then finally, another key thing, on this part of the answer is going to be what's every team's role? So who's responsible for what, and how are the different teams going to work together to, basically meet that benchmark? The second thing that can be done that's critical pre-movement to the cloud, or if you are just coming in as a security practitioner to an existing cloud infrastructure, is education. You need to take the time and the effort for the individuals and the teams to learn about the new technologies you're going to be working with. Securing cloud infrastructure brings a whole nother level of challenges, but there's a whole nother level of capabilities as well. So you need to take the time to really freshen up your skill set, learn new things, and devote the time for that. So that's sort of like the pre-movement to the cloud, or if you're just thrown into the cloud very suddenly. And then when you're looking at identifying misconfigurations after a cloud migration, you really need to examine your tool set and look for things that are going to provide you a very simple, seamless, and easy way to get a full view of all of the different clouds and cloud services you're consuming in one specific view, and then kind of go from there. But the first piece is finding the right tooling for your specific environment, your environment.
Great, thank you. And Joseph?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest mistakes that many organizations make is they try to retrofit what they've done on premise and actually plug it into the cloud. And that's what reason why we see a lot of the misconfigurations resulting in a lot of breaches. And even cloud has become one of the #1 targets from cyber criminals now. So it's even overtaken on-premise as being the primary target. So organizations really need to think differently about how they protect their cloud assets. And the reason why it's very different is that in traditional on-premise, you're protecting the door to the organization, that traditional firewalls, DMZs, and network-based security. But when you look at the cloud, you have to think about, well, why is it different? And it all comes down to identity and access. That means that you really need to get down to the very granular details of control about who has access to what and what they can do and how much access. So when we think about the cloud security, the biggest cause of misconfigurations is that its security is actually, they take the default settings. And unfortunately, in the default settings in cloud, it typically means security is turned off. And this means you have to go through the actually process and the actually techniques of enabling it and using it correctly. So this is where it's really important to make sure that you actually go to from security by design to actually security by default. And this means for cloud resources, you have to take the principle of least privilege, making sure you start off with the least amount of privilege, or I refer to it sometimes as moving away from basically having persistent privileges to actually having non-persistent privileges, meaning that users need to verify who they are, where they're coming from, why they should have the access, and all of that can have security controls running in the background. So it's really critical to make sure that we get the security by default and we secure and control the identities and access into cloud environments, because that's the number one priority that you have to make sure that your cloud environments become more resilient.
Okay, great. Excellent. And Alexander.
Yeah, I was just going to follow on echoing some of the similar sentiments Joseph just made. The cloud is the preferred target these days, right? As of 2020, the cloud is more targeted than the on-prem environment for the overall vulnerability assessments, or for the looking for vulnerabilities to go and compromise and doing something. And it is critically important to be doing at least something about it, right? There are a number of open source things out there that you can implement if you're not going to do anything, right? Like if nothing else, at least take some base precautions, right? There's things like a cloud custodian to be able to do analysis and looking at kind of static stuff. There's things like Falco to look at runtime configuration changes, right? There's a number of things in the open source suite that are built for this cloud native world and are pretty low table stakes things to do before you start investing a ton into it. Like if you just don't want to dump some money at it, at least look at what's out there in the open source world. There's stuff you can be doing to be able to have some sense of security posture in your cloud configuration. I won't belabor anything else somebody else has said, but just wanted to throw that out there. So.
All right, all excellent points. Thank you. And so now we'll jump into visibility, because that's certainly a concern for many organizations. Visibility across the entire security infrastructure is critical so that security leaders can effectively monitor, protect, and respond. However, organizations reported that a lack of visibility is one of their top risks. What can security teams do to overcome fragmentation of numerous platforms and gain visibility to minimize this risk? So could we begin with Prakash?
Yeah. So Matt made the point earlier about, look, you need to consolidate visibility. And I think there was general agreement from everybody that you need to consolidate visibility. And I think one of the roads to consolidating visibility is centralizing control. Now, let me be clear. Centralized control does not mean centralized ownership, because we are past the point of, IT must own all business applications. That is not going to happen anymore. Ownership is going to be distributed to business units, and IT teams are just not staffed to own everything, right? So it's not about ownership, but it's more about control. And what elements can they control, right? They can we think the most important elements to control are these notions of identity, permission, policy, and devices. This seems to be a theme in my earlier answer too, right? I think because those are the four key vectors where breaches can happen. And to build on the same example, right? When I said just because Jack has admin privileges on AWS does not mean Jack should have admin privileges on every application that's built on AWS. And Jack should not have admin privileges on Salesforce, right? So you need to make sure that you set policy in a centralized fashion that allows you to look across these applications and platforms so that you can then centralize visibility, right? And you've got to find a way to centralize this control without eliminating the flexibility. That usually means building a layer of policy over all the applications so that this notion of identity is centralized, so that permissions don't necessarily on each application don't necessarily need to be managed centrally, but can be monitored centrally. This let's do an audit manually every 6 months on every application is not going to scale. Given how do you put together some technology that can automatically audit across all these applications and your infrastructure and give you an easy to see report that says, Kathleen was given all these privileges because her boss said she needs to get up and running tomorrow, but she's used 20% of those. The remaining 80% can be revoked. Right? That's the kind of visibility you can get when you centralize control.
Great points. Matt, would you like to follow on?
Yes, absolutely. So, in often take an approach, which is very easy, is to take your on-premises tool sets and move those into the cloud. So that can leave some significant gaps. Those tools were typically developed to solve a specific function or maybe one specific domain within security, and they don't take advantage of the cloud native architecture. So by moving those into the cloud and then trying to stitch together the output of those, security teams can really become their own worst enemy, like getting bits of information here or there, but never really getting a big picture. So when you move to the cloud, there's a whole new set of capabilities. So security teams need to be open to taking this opportunity to investigate new tools and resources that are developed for the cloud, specifically for the cloud. So, get out of your comfort zone a little bit, learn new things, talk to a technology partner, provider, or vendor, maybe tell them what your plans are, ask them what they're seeing, and if there's a possibility that they can help, just be open to having more open conversations with people outside of your existing tool sets and capabilities.
Great, thank you. And Alexander, do you have some additional insight to add?
Yeah, what I was going to say is there was a good analogy that Joseph made in the last question about the on-prem data center being kind of a castle. If on-prem is a castle, cloud is a circus or a carnival, right? Every single service is its own little thing, and you have all sorts of folks trying to access and do stuff in their worlds, right? There is no longer a notion of a single ingress or egress or a simple way to kind of protect the world because it has a bunch of entry points, right? You have every persona doing things in those. And thankfully, the cloud has enabled us to look at those services individually via different mechanisms, right? In AWS, they call it CloudTrail. Google has an offering, IBM has an offering, Azure has an offering for the similar things. And being able to effectively instrument those particular cloud trails, those particular changes in those services as things are going on, becomes utterly critical, right? You can't monitor everything holistically. You monitor it by different things being leveraged and used. And to Matt's point, you have to aggregate those things centrally. So if you can effectively instrument the different services you're leveraging, the cloud services, when things change, and that very, very quickly. Responding to those configuration changes becomes kind of the critical point for handling security in that cloud world. And it's just something that can't be understated, right? It's kind of like the wild, wild west in the cloud in some ways. And you have to be able to handle these things in a way that's native to your environment you're in, and lets you look at each service individually to look for modifications, changes, things in real time.
Excellent, thank you. And Prakash, is there anything else you might want to add to this?
Yeah, as Alexander reminded me about this analogy of the castle and the carnival, right? One of the things about a carnival is this constant movement and change. I think the cloud world has that too. So it's visibility in the cloud world is not a static notion, right? It's making sure you have continuous visibility and you maintain that visibility as things change. So I think as organizations think about visibility, they need to think about not a once and done snapshot, but how do I maintain that as things change in that carnival?
Okay, great. Now this next question is near and dear to my work because we support the underserved. So all those organizations that don't have enough resources to do things, and nonprofit. So I'm not advertising for any services, more looking for great responses to see what can be done to help this underserved community. Can automation help overcome the lack of qualified or knowledgeable staff? And so with this, Kenneth, would you like to kick off?
Well, yes and no. Automation is a force multiplier, but it requires its own supervision, its own maintenance, its own roadmap. It's not a static solution. Once you implement automation, then you have to maintain the automation. You have to upgrade it. You have to change it as your business processes change. So it can make the employees that you have more effective at what they do. But there are a lot of people that are worried that automation is going to eliminate jobs as well. But that's not, I haven't found that to be true in my experience. What it does is it takes capable people who are knowledgeable about your company and your processes and frees them up to do the kinds of things that only humans are capable of doing, such as innovating and figuring out new things, doing the types of things that we can't automate yet. I think that every company needs to be investing in automation as much as is practical for their risk management appetite. and for what their capabilities are. And if they aren't, they're going to be left in the dust.
Okay, and Matt, would you like to add to this discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think those were some great points. And I don't think automation is going to replace skilled staff in the near future, but as mentioned, it can certainly help. So we're all aware there's a major shortage of talent in the cybersecurity field, and I don't think that gap is going to be filled anytime soon. So what automation can do for us is to allow us to leverage our limited resources in the most effective and efficient way possible. So, a couple examples of those are, would you rather have, your team members going out and, manually sifting through dozens of technologies to find alerts or misconfigurations and then remediate those? Or would you rather have tooling automatically correlate those things together, present them so then a human can evaluate them and take action? Or, from a deployment perspective, would you rather have people going through and clicking through manually deploying resources? Or would you rather automate through a template-driven process that you can put security controls and guardrails around the deployment of your infrastructure so that you can get ahead of these risky misconfigurations? So I think it's absolutely critical to helping knowledgeable staff today. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes. And if we can automate at scale for the benefit of those without resources, all the better.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I'll move to our next question. When working with a cloud solution provider, how do companies ensure they're choosing the right type? Is security the responsibility of the provider or the client? And with this, Kenneth, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I'll address the second question first. Security is the responsibility of both of them. It's a shared security model. That's one of the big benefits. I mentioned that earlier because it provides you with better security, more security that's more encompassing of your environment at a cheaper price, because you have experts on the CSP side who are dedicated to protecting that infrastructure, and you offload that responsibility, the cost, and the time spent doing that sort of thing to them. So the shared security model really helps out with that. As for figuring out which CSP is the right one for you, that's a much more complicated question, and it involves understanding yourself. You have to know your own company's internal processes, what your compute is used for, what type of data you have and process, what your data flows look like, what your workflows look like, your use cases, your end-to-end processes, all of that sort of thing. If you don't know that, which granted, companies grow organically, so that gets complex over time, and you might not have a straightforward answer for that. It's worth taking the time to try and figure it out, try and draw it out, try to map it out, try to make the documentation that would explain to anybody coming into the company how all that stuff works. And by understanding that, then you'll be able to look at the service offerings from the various cloud service providers, identify which ones mesh best with your own processes and which presents the least amount of risk to your organization, and go with that. None of them are going to be a perfect fit, but the only way you're going to find the right one for you is by understanding yourself.
Okay, excellent. So now I'm going to go into the hot topic of zero trust. Zero trust architecture has been a hot topic as organizations transition to this model from traditional perimeter security models. How do companies successfully implement zero trust for the cloud? And how does doing so help secure the cloud environment? And so with this question, I'd like to turn over to Joseph to begin.
Absolutely. I think this kind of relates a little bit to the question earlier when we talked about, in regards to the misconfiguration side of things. A lot of the causes of security breaches are from misconfigurations, specifically around users being overprivileged. And zero trust is really there to try and actually reduce the risk of that, or try to at least eliminate it. Now, I'm not a big fan of the name zero trust itself, because one of the challenges is that most people from the business perspective thinks it's no longer trusting users. And security is here to really help the business. It's here to reduce the risk and support the business. So we have to make sure that we find a fine balance between that. Now, when I think about zero trust, I prefer to think of it as zero assumptions, or actually creating security that has zero friction. And also, you don't think about implementing zero trust. You put zero trust processes in place to help make sure you do continuous verification and continuous validation, and making sure that your security controls are being satisfied and met through contextual-based security. So, one of the terms I've heard, being used for zero trust itself, it's a mindset in how you wish to operate your business in a secure way. So it's about how you apply security to the business. So it's about when you can approach cloud, you have to think about the principle of least privilege. You have to think about continuous verification. You have to think about what risk am I reducing? And zero trust is really about a mindset and how you apply that. There is solutions, of course, that has zero trust features that help you get there, that help apply it to certain things like access controls or auditing or peer approval processes. So there is things that helps you achieve it in certain areas. So it's important to think about it as a journey. You never check it off. It's never finished. It's never a project that you actually ever come to completion. You had to keep doing it in order to maintain a high level of zero trust posture. So yes, absolutely. It's an important topic and definitely something that all organizations should strive to be able to adhere to and operate as.
All right, excellent, Joseph. Zero trust is certainly a journey. Prakash, would you like to add to this?
Yeah, just right. Zero trust has become this overused term. So whether you're tired of hearing or not, whether you like the term or not, first, zero trust is not a product. It is not an event either, right? It really is an approach. And successfully implementing or adopting a zero trust approach in our context requires, I think, the following three things. One is cloud centricity, continuous refinement to match the dynamic cloud world, and making adoption easier, right? So what do I mean by cloud centricity, right? I think it was Kenneth that mentioned earlier, don't take what you built for the network and slap it onto the cloud and go, well, I'm done now. Right? That's not going to work. So taking network-centric security approaches and trying to use them on the cloud is not going to work. Because in the cloud world, what is the notion of a network? What does the network give you access to? Right? If you have AWS and Salesforce.com, what is your network? So make sure you're using cloud-centric methodologies and solutions. And zero trust is not a once and done. I think this has been also a theme in my answers, right? This is a dynamic world. Continue to monitor, continue to tune policies, permissions, identity, so that you make sure that the policies defined are not only applicable as the world changes, but are also being adhered to. The third element that I think Joseph talked about also was this notion that security and user experience need to be at odds should be dispelled. We have to get to a point where we can eliminate the friction, and security leaders are not seen as business blockers, but business enablers, right? And so to the extent that you start using technology that slows down users, makes it inconvenient for them, they're going to find workarounds. You need to think about the easy button, and you really need to think hard about the technologies you're choosing and how they don't make the easy button the hard button. Right? Make sure that the friction is removed in the adoption, and people are not trying to look for workarounds to circumvent the security that you work so hard to put in place to get access to the resources in a timely fashion and to take advantage of the agility that the cloud offers.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to dive a little bit more into topics related to zero trust with this next question. How important is it to protect cloud privileged access? And Joseph, I think this is an area of expertise for you.
Absolutely. And this is really, what it gets into is the keys of the kingdom. It's really, cyber criminals and attackers really go after these high-level privileged accounts. And we can look at all of the big data breaches in the last couple of months have all basically come down to that a privileged account had been abused at some point along in the attack vector. It's what attackers use to be able to hide their tracks, to get away with the crime, to be able to steal data, to deploy a ransomware across the organization. So it's really important to make sure that organizations discover, audit, find out what these privileges are, and lock them down, put the right security controls in place. And it's really important, as Prakash had mentioned, is we had to make it usable. We had to make it something that employees want to use. It has to make their job actually better. Anytime we put a security solution in place, it has to be better than the existing way that users are doing it today. So one thing that privileged cloud access provides is the ability to move things like passwords into the background. So employees no longer need to choose or remember or create or just add 1 or 2 to the end of a password, we can move those into the background and help automate and help improve that experience and take away the password pain. So this is where basically privileged access, especially for cloud, allows you to access many different environments across the infrastructure, applications, SaaS, no matter where they are, and put the right security controls in place, improving user experience. And that's really how we should be measured in security, is one is return on investment and user experience. Those are the 2 metrics that we should be looking to in order to improve the business. And that's where security becomes no longer just a cost, but an enabler for the business itself.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to go back to visibility just to dive into that a bit more. We understand the importance of visibility when assessing risk in the cloud. What role does context play in effective risk assessment? And for this one, I'd like to turn to Matt.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that context is absolutely critical. So when we have full visibility into an environment and we benchmark it, naturally, we're going to get a lot of findings. But how do we prioritize those? And when we look at a compliance benchmark, a finding that's relatively high or critical within the benchmark might not have the same criticality when it's in our environment. So if we take a look at a typical finding, hey, we have an unencrypted EBS volume. Well, let's kind of look at that for a minute here. So maybe we have an unencrypted EBS volume that's on an inactive EC2 instance that's in a subnet or a network structure that has no effective network exposure, public network exposure. I'm a little bit less concerned about that than, say, another unencrypted EBS volume that is on an active EC2 instance with public network exposure that's maybe running a database workload and running with a highly privileged user account or an effective admin user account that maybe has some exposed secrets on that. So if I go back to my benchmark, I have 2 resources with the same finding, but I think we'll agree that, example number 2 is much more risky to my environment. And I want to prioritize that over, say, example 1. So when we're looking at tooling and we're looking at the visibility that we're gaining, it's can we identify from how things are actually deployed in our environment and how does that affect the actual risk that it presents to us?
All right, great. Thank you. And Joseph.
Absolutely. Just to add to Matt's point, I think this is really important. And this is something we have to do as an industry to change, is that ultimately we have to remember that security doesn't exist for the sake of security. It's all about the business risk. It's about doing data impact assessments. It's about doing business risk assessments to understand about what it is we're protecting and what value does that have that we're protecting as well. What is the cost of that system being down? And this is really where we have to change our mindset into understanding about security exists to support the business, to make it more resilient. So everything is all about having that visibility. And what is that cyber gap? What is the cost of actually putting something in place to reduce that risk? So absolutely, we have to be changing the way we actually measure and apply security and also translate it. We have to be better translators from actually security risk into what it means for the business as well. So this is an important area. And I think this is the only way, my view is that the only way we can ever get budget is when we can properly communicate to the executive team about what it is we're actually doing to reduce the business risk. And getting that visibility is so critical. You can protect what you can't see. And this is where, aligning and understanding the business is so critical that we need, people like Bizos, the business information security officer has to be that translator from security risk into business risk.
Great, excellent point on justifying costs associated to business risk. And Prakash.
Yeah, Matt talked about context and, Joseph talked about privileged accounts, right? One of the things that I would add in both of these cases is, like I've said before, this is a very dynamic world, right? Who has privilege is constantly changing. Kathleen got privilege to deploy a new application on AWS. Did that privilege get taken away when Kathleen was done? Right? And in the cloud world, context is constantly changing. And Kathleen is working from Timbuktu today and Brazil tomorrow. Do we want to give her the same privileges, whether she's on a managed device in Timbuktu or an unmanaged device in Brazil? So because of the constantly changing nature of privileges and context, make sure that your approach incorporates the ability to track this dynamism of the cloud.
All right, great, thank you. And I'm dreaming of the great meals I could have in these exotic locations. So with that, I'd like to close out this wonderful session today with each of these esteemed panelists and give you the opportunity to touch upon some highlights for our theme on securing the cloud. And I'll go back in alphabetical order. Joseph, would you like to kick off, please?
Absolutely. Kind of just to summarize, I think it's really important is one is, the cloud is definitely the path we're going. And it's definitely something that all organizations will be able to actually innovate and help the business be successful long-term. So definitely we're going there. And the important thing is to embrace it with responsibility, to understand it, to really understand about what makes it different, how you can apply the right security controls to, take advantage of it. We've mentioned that, a lot of these cloud solutions come with security built in. And it's really important how you take advantage and make that a value to the business, make it something that the business can embrace. So I think it's really about making sure, one is you plan it accordingly, you actually understand what that journey will look like, and really embrace it with responsibility. I think that's one of the key things. And definitely, if you're interested in learning more about privileges and how to protect the access to your cloud environments, come see us at the Delinea booth afterwards. So thank you.
Great, thank you. And Kenneth.
I think that, like Joseph was saying, everything is moving more and more towards the cloud. I think that as the federal regulations, at least in the US, continue to evolve around that, then more and more workloads are going to be moved to the cloud that were traditionally on premises. It's just a model that makes sense for moving into the future. But you have to understand your environment. You have to have visibility into all the different context, as Matt was mentioning, around what things are doing and how they're what risk they present to you, because ultimately it does come down to that risk decision. But the whether or not cloud adoption is something you should be thinking about doing or not, yes, that's the answer.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alexander.
Yeah, I think the main thing I would say to kind of sum up here is that doing all of the stuff in the cloud is the trend of the future, but taking into account how it is happening in real time, I think is one of the key things, right? Again, going back to the fact that a cloud is more like a carnival than a castle, being able to instrument stuff in a native way and looking at things in real time as they're changing, because things are changing so fast, is utterly critical. And there's a lot of community tooling out there that is aimed at solving these exact problems, right? There's a great notion of kind of shifting some of our security knowledge into kind of the more open realm, and using each other to help be better about how we secure things, right? It doesn't have to be a siloed conversation like inside your organization. It's okay to collaborate and work with others, and do that in a way that helps everybody get better.
All right, great. Thank you. Prakash.
Yeah, some numbers from McKinsey said that the digital transformation that was going to happen in the next 10 years was compressed into the 6 months or a year during the pandemic, right? Whether we agree with the numbers or not, the fact is there was acceleration of digital transformation. And understandably, businesses made the trade-off between let's get everybody access and security, right? Here, we're not here to throw stones at them and go, that was the necessary right thing to do. But it's time to go reassess and go, what gaps did I introduce when I moved everything to the cloud, and start addressing them, right? Because we are on the other side, people are coming back to offices at some places. How do you make sure that the security controls that you intended or needed are indeed in place? So it's okay to go back and reassess and start somewhere.
All right, great. Thank you. And Matt.
Yeah, no, I think Prakash made a very good statement at the beginning of the panel session here, where whether we know it or not organizationally, most likely we're already in the cloud. So knowing that, as security practitioners, we just need to be able to jump right in, understand that, don't be afraid to learn new things, try new tooling, and just approach it with an open mind.
All right, excellent. Thank you to each of our panelists for an informative and very interesting session. I enjoyed it myself, and I hope everyone attending did as well. If you're left with more questions, please take the opportunity to visit the either in-person or virtual booths for each of the organizations to learn more. Thank you again.